Hey, hi everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Valerie Camiso, and I'm the Vice President of Membership at MSNY. For those of you who may not know, MSNY is the only professional association that represents all physicians in New York State. We provide access to practical resources and a strong community of professional peers to help you connect, to influence, to engage, and to learn. And if you're not already a member, I encourage you to join at msny.org, mssny.org. And we understand the time crunch you experience every day, so we want to be efficient. Today, we will start with a presentation, and after that, we'll take a few questions. I've got a few questions that were sent in advance, but you can post your questions in the Q&A or in the chat on your screen, and we'll answer as many as we can get to at the end. And I really do urge you to ask questions and to engage, because here's your opportunity for some free consulting. MSNY works with many partners who have been carefully vetted on your behalf. And today we're pleased to offer you a webinar with one of those partners, Resolve. Resolve helps physicians negotiate employment contracts like a pro. Today's presentation is entitled Salary Data and Contract Review Tips. And since Resolve works with physicians daily, they want to help you make the most of your contract. So get ready to learn, because we're going to be answering that question. Our speaker today is Kyle Claussen. Kyle is the CEO of Resolve, and he spent the last decade advocating for physicians in their employment contracts. Thousands of physicians utilize Resolve's data, their tools, and their expertise each year to ensure they are being treated fairly in their employment contracts. Kyle's also married to an ophthalmologist. He's got 3 kids and a dog, maybe a white picket fence as well. So with that, Kyle, I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all yours.
No fence, just trees in the backyard. So thank you. Appreciate that. I know it's lunchtime for you guys, and your days are busy. So we're going to try to go through this in about 20 minutes. Let you ask questions, as many as you want. You can use the Q&A while we go through slides. I'll try to answer them as we go, and or at the end. But the topic today is what you should be paid and what you should be careful of in a contract, right? And so I think as we start that conversation, market dynamics are going to have a play on all of that, right? And so I think all of you are aware of these 3 bullets, but I do want to make sure you remember that as you think about what you're being paid, what your options are. There's always, for the last 15, 20, plus years, maybe forever, been a shortage of physicians. We don't have enough of you. And so in most markets, if there's a shortage of something, that creates, right, price changes. So if we don't have enough physicians, you would think, right, you have a lot of leverage, right, your compensation should be going up. At the same time, in the market, there's a lot of consolidation, a lot of employment that's now in place. Most physicians out of training, it's like almost 90% are going into an employed model. So private practice isn't gone completely, but it does change who you're negotiating with, right? It's not likely a colleague. It's probably an institution, or a large health system, academic center, things like that. And physicians today tend to have slightly different priorities, at least from the clients that we talk to and speak with, versus what they did 10 or 15 years ago. We see a lot of emphasis now, because that ownership and partnership and kind of control is no longer there, that they're wanting to protect things like call, schedule, where they're going to practice, locations, right? Because it's not their practice. They're subject to a larger organization. So I'm not going to tell you that any of that is good or bad, right? It is what it is. And so you got to factor that into your discussion. So your strategy for reviewing your situation, your contract, your offers, number one is you've got to know what's important to you, right? Most clients come to us with some type of geographic preference that drives decision making. Some are focused on just maximizing compensation. Sometimes it's scope of practice, what you want to do, and or having protected time for things like research or teaching. Those have to happen before you come to us or before you're looking for a job, right? You need to know what you're after. But the next 3 are really important, right? So once you have a contract, you need to know contract risk. You need to know where to go to find market data and what the norms are. And you need to have some idea of how you're going to negotiate and what you're likely going to experience as part of that process, okay? So that's what we're going to cover today. Let's talk about contract risk quickly. We're not going to hit every single item in a contract, but I think we're going to hit most of them that they're going to cause you problems. Okay. So the first category that I like to have you think about is just anything that's going to touch on what your duties and responsibilities are. Okay. And this paragraph that we've got on the right-hand side of the slide is how most contracts start. They start out saying you're going to work whenever we tell you to, wherever we tell you to, and you're going to take call, kind of according to our policies. If that doesn't fit for you, right, it's probably not what you were told in the interview. There was a lot of detail that went into those conversations. You may want to have some adjustments to that section, right? So locations of practice, which days of the week you're going to work, how much call you're going to take, pay attention to that, make sure you're careful. Okay, other things that are going to fall into this category of what your responsibilities are include things like side gigs, right? A lot of clients now have interest in moonlighting, interest in consulting, being an expert witness, working with a health tech company as an advisor. Okay. All of those things usually are prevented by your contract. It says that you can't do outside activities unless you get our consent. It also says you can't keep the revenue on that unless we've given you our consent. So be really, really careful on that. And that ties into intellectual property as well. If you're creating things, right, especially in that health tech space, right, you're creating intellectual property for a third party, you need to be careful that your contract doesn't, put some hooks in that and expect that that's going to belong to your current employer. Okay. And then other things that I would pay attention to in this bucket are whether you want to supervise APPs, so nurse practitioners, physician assistants, CRNAs, things like that. Some clients are absolutely expecting that. It's been discussed. There's compensation for it. Others, we see contracts that are very, very broad on that. There's been no discussion around it. And so it can really affect, again, your day in and day out. So be careful on that part. And then also, if you do want to have that protected time that we talked about before for things like administration, right, charting, or research, teaching, make sure you're carving that in the contract so there's no missed expectations on kind of this category number one. Okay. So that's your first set of issue spotting. Your second set of issue spotting should be around compensation. And this is, we're going to talk about compensation models and where to find some data on this stuff. But most contracts are still going to be structured with a base salary that has some production component tied to it. Okay. There's certainly some that focus on quality. There are other ancillary things that we'll talk about here that may go along with it, but most of your compensation is going to be tied to those two buckets. So you need to know how you're paid, what model they're using, if it's a work RVU model, if it's a collection model, if it's a gross charges or encounters or ASA units or whatever it is for your specialty. Understanding that and knowing how that compares to the median and other factors is the slide we're going to go through next. Okay, but things that you should be looking for in addition to just base and production, we see relocation allowances in almost every contract. It's 90% plus. We see signing bonuses in the majority of contracts. Roughly 70% will have that. Those amounts can really vary. So we're going to talk medians again in a second and what that looks like. But depending on location, a real rural location versus a major metro location, you're going to see really big fluctuations from, $10,000 maybe in a signing bonus to six figures plus. And so even if you see the median for your specialty at 20, 30,000, just know that you may have room to push on those numbers. Okay. And then other things, if it is a really high demand, location, things like stipends while you finish training, student loan forgiveness, there may be other benefits that can come along with the job, right? So you need to analyze the situation for those things. The one item I do want to touch on is group benefits, because we have a lot of clients that come in and ask why the 401k is not listed out explicitly, why the health insurance isn't detailed enough. And the reason for that is because those group policies are non-negotiable items on a case-by-case basis. So they have to give you the same health insurance they're giving to everyone else. So you may not see a lot of detail on those items in your contract, but you should see details on things like CME, vacation, if they're going to pay for your licensing and other dues. Those are not group benefits. They can change those as needed on a one-off basis if they want to. Okay. So let's look at an example of how I'd have you think about compensation and how you should think about analyzing that. We're going to walk through a work RVU example and a collection example, but you can apply this to any model, right? Even if your model's not listed up here, you can take the same analysis through any of these. So let's focus on work RVUs, column one here for a second. And let's say you get a contract that has an offer of 200,000 and you go check the data sources, and median comp is also 200,000. And so you think, wonderful, right? I'm exactly where I should be for this area. I'm at the median, and I'm happy about that. And then you go look at your next paragraph, which talks about your production expectations and bonusing. And it says in your contract that to bonus, you need to cross 3,000 work RVUs annually. Okay. If you don't know what the market says for production, you don't know what that median is for work RVUs per year. A lot of clients are going to walk into a situation where they're producing more work RVUs than what their base is accounting for. Okay. And so it's going to put you at a deficit. So if you look at that data set again, and it says median's 2,500 work RVUs, so 2,500 gets you to that 200,000 number, and your contract says you've got to get to 3,000, you should have, right, bells going off saying, okay, something's not lining up here. And if every work RVU is worth $40 in this example, that's a $20,000 gap, right, or a $20,000 shortage in that settings, or roughly 10% of the offer. Okay, so you're being asked to produce 3,000, your colleagues are being asked to produce 2,500, and so you're $20,000 short. Okay, and you can take that same analysis, analyzing the base versus analyzing the production, to a collection model. In the collection model, you're going to get paid a percentage of any collections that come in. So if you look at the bottom half of column 2, if the median's 500 and your contract says 600, right, you're losing out on 30% of that $100,000 difference. So it's a $30,000 deficit. And even though your base is higher in this example at 200 versus 190, you're still down 20,000. So you're positive 10 in your base analysis, you're negative 30 on your production analysis. And so when you combine those two together, if you end up producing at 600,000, you're still short, 20,000 as opposed to your colleagues. Okay. So we can come back to that and answer questions if we need to, but that's generally how I'd have you think about your compensation structure and whether or not it's fair. Is, if I produce at median, do I earn median? If I produce at a higher level, do I earn at that higher level? Or is there some type of discrepancy or gap, right, between those two spots? Okay. Last area in the contract for issue spotting that I think is really important and that often goes overlooked is anything that touches termination. So we know that physicians are going to have likely multiple employers, right, throughout your careers, especially now that private practice is a minority position. And so you have to know how much notice to give to get out of a contract. You have to know financially what the repercussions are going to be if the contract ends. And financially means, one, who's paying for tail on my malpractice insurance? Two, do I have any repayment obligations on the signing bonus that I took, or the relocation allowance that I took, or that student loan forgiveness? And then three, what happens to my production? So if I'm 10 months into a contract and I'm in the positive, right, for that production bonus, and then my contract ends, do they prorate that back? Do I get, a certain percentage of that, or do I just lose it because I haven't finished the full year? Okay. So those are kind of the termination red flags or things to pay attention to. Other things that fall into termination that aren't necessarily financial, but could be a problem, would be things like a force majeure clause. So this is a kind of a post-COVID provision that's come in, and it'll basically allows either party to terminate the contract at any point in time if there's what's called an act of God. And act of gods include things like hurricanes and fires and earthquakes, and they were traditionally in construction contracts to protect builders, right, from those bad events and then not being in breach of contract. One of the categories of this force majeure is pandemics. Okay. And so during COVID, what we saw is a lot of people got furloughed, comp cuts, right? Scope of practice got moved around. And I think employers knew that likely all of those things were breach of contract, but they didn't have this clause in. And so now you're seeing that in most contracts. You want to be careful on it. It doesn't generally protect you. It's protecting the organization in most settings. Okay. So the other big one in termination, and we've got a slide specifically for this, is non-competes. So aside from the financial issues, you need to know where you can practice if the relationship ends, if your contract terminates. And most contracts are going to have some form of non-compete in them. There are certain states that have banned these, right? New York has considered it, right? And there's no full decision on that yet. The FTC is considering it. Again, no full decision on that yet either. So as of right now, you got to be really careful what your contract says about where you can work post-termination. If there's one circle being drawn for 2 miles, if it's 5 or 6 or 7 circles being drawn for 2 miles, right, that really changes where you can go to work. And that's kind of the image that we have up here, the example. So knowing that restricted area, knowing how that's defined, certainly language you want to pay attention to. You want to minimize time, you want to minimize restricted area as much as you can, and also add some exceptions if possible for things like no fault termination, meaning they just let you go for no reason, or they get merged or bought out by private equity before you become a partner. Maybe a good reason to waive the non-compete, right? There's lots of scenarios you can think of to have exclusions and carve outs, in this area. Okay. Okay. So once you've spotted hopefully most of the issues in the contract, you need to know where to go to get market data. And there's 3 categories again that I'd have you consider as part of this. The first one is going to be what I call survey data. This is large benchmarks that most employers utilize for fair market value compliance. You're going to see acronyms like MGMA, AMGA, Sullivan and Cotter, AAMC, right? There's a handful that are out there. If your contract references a paragraph like the one that's bottom left here that talks about we can't pay you past a certain percentile of a certain survey, that's a pretty good indicator that you should be using that or another survey close to that for your analysis, right? Because they're verifying that they're using that for compliance. So you should also be using that for analyzing your compensation, right? In other terms. So that's one set. The second set is what you can find on our website. So if you go to resolve.com, there are confidential and anonymous but verified contract points for you to look at. So you can see what your specialty may be being offered in a certain state, right? And you can drill down on that. You can see timing on it. You can see signing bonuses, relocation allowances, work RVU conversion factors, right? Every point that we've talked about so far, you can hop in and actually look at the details of these contracts, not knowing whose it is or what employer it's with, but it'll still give you a very good idea of what the market says your services are worth, okay? And then the final data point that I'd have you think about is just other offers that you're looking at, right? Hopefully, if you're considering a job, you've got 2 or 3 that you're considering. If you're going to renegotiate, hopefully you've paid attention to the market, you know roughly what's out there. I think that's your best snapshot. But certainly you want to combine all 3 of these if you can. Okay, when you're trying to determine fair market value. And the reason I think you need all 3 is there is a lot of variance, right, between not only those 3 data sets, but also just between different filters that you can pull. So as an example, depending on filters for a specialty, right, in these surveys, you can be anywhere from a median of 316 to a median of 123. And that's based on, population of the city. It's based on years of practice. It's based on region, right? So it's all of these different things can be filtered through. And obviously, if your situation is one where the median would be 316 and they're offering you 242, that's a pretty big jump. And you're going to want to make sure you've got data to help support those adjustments. Okay. All right. Last step on this is you've got to, hopefully you've seen the issues, you've seen the data. If you know that now it's time to negotiate those things, what should you expect as part of that process? Okay. We encourage you to know your BATNA and to do everything in good faith. So kind of the first 2 categories here on this slide, you need to know what to do if they're going to say no to everything, or if they say no to some of your deal breakers. You should have that thought out prior to entering into the negotiation. And you should also go into the negotiation in good faith, meaning you're not asking for every single T to be crossed, in my opinion, or formatting issues in the document, right? What you should be focusing on is the things that are most important to you, right? And those aren't always the same things. So non-competes are a great example. I think they're terrible, right? I wish they weren't in contracts at all. But if you come to me and say, I'm in New York right now, I grew up in California, right? If this job doesn't work out, I'm absolutely moving to California. There's no way I'm staying in the area. Even if the non-compete is 200 miles in that setting, it doesn't matter for you, right? Personally. And so would I have you waste your time or spend your time trying to negotiate that down? Probably not, right? Because it's not important to you for your situation. So go in knowing not only what your deal breakers are, absolutely you should be asking about that, but you should also be asking about anything that has a lot of risk to it, right? Even if it's not a for sure deal breaker, but it's just not industry standard language. You should be careful on those things. And then finally, you need to be prepared to answer the question or hear the response that this is a standard contract, everybody signed it, right? So we see changes in about 85% of the contracts that we review and go through, whether that's numbers or language. And to give you an example of what that looks like and how that can come back, This is language directly from in-house counsel, saying that the contract we offer to this physician is the same thing that we offer to everybody. It's been vetted, over the past 15 years. And then all of that said, we're going to change our non-compete, right, for this physician. And so if they're changing that, once, they're probably changing multiple things for multiple positions, as they should, because recruitment and retention is really hard, right? And so to lose a really good candidate over, a provision here or there, hopefully the business side says, yes, it's worth it to have these adjustments made. Okay. So how much movement is there? If you can get a 10% adjustment, which is fairly common, over the course of a physician's career, that's about 2.5 million in career earnings. So it's absolutely worth paying attention to make sure you're at fair market value at all times. But it's not only comp that has value. And I think this is a really interesting statistic from the FTC. They talk about physician comp in their discussion, in their opinion, and they think in certain markets that there's up to a 37% reduction or compression of compensation right now because of the lack of competition. And so when you see things like that, that's a really big number, right? I mean, it's 9.3 million for the average physician. Could be more, could be less, depending on your specialty. But removing a non-compete really gives you leverage later on for any renegotiation. So don't skip that part, and don't kind of gloss over that important termination provision. Okay. So if you have questions, one, I'm hopeful that you'll plug them in. We're right at 20 minutes. If you want to go on and check out resolve.com, there's a lot of free resources there for you. You can hop on and kind of rate your contract. You can look at some of that data. As Valerie mentioned before, not only did they vet us, a lot of other organizations have too. So we feel pretty strongly about that. We want to make sure we're very physician friendly. And with that, I will take any and all questions that you have.
Kyle, I have a couple of questions for you. You talked about the non-competes.
Mhm.
If someone is really opposed to signing a contract that has a non-compete clause, how do you negotiate differently? How do you work with those employers that would consider that?
Yeah, I think non-competes are one that employers feel pretty strongly about, right? And rightfully so. I mean, they want to have something that's consistent because it's more likely to be enforced in those settings if it is consistent. But if it's also a deal breaker for you, I mean, you have to have a carve out, right? And even if you can't get the thing removed entirely, let's say you want to have a carve out that lets you go to academics, right? If you're not in an academic setting, or to go to the VA because the VA is non-competitive. There's ways to limit them, to allow the employer to still have maybe some of the non-compete in place and to still give you options. If you're opposed to them entirely, I think that's probably one of the first conversations you need to have, because if it's going to be a deal breaker for you and it's a deal breaker for them, let's not waste our time.
Yeah, why
going
bother?
through the points. Yeah, let's just get to it right away. So I think it depends on how much of a deal breaker it really is for the client.
How about when someone's contract, you've got a renewal date for your contract. At what point do you start negotiating a new salary? Do you do that before the contract expires? Do you do it as the contract expires? Like, what do you recommend for that?
Well, most contracts now are kind of evergreen, so they just keep rolling forward. Even if you have a 5-year term, it's usually auto renewing, and then there's a termination clause that says either party can terminate on 90 days notice. So my suggestion is probably not 2 months after you've signed, right? That's just from a political capital standpoint, probably not the best move. But if market data shifts and changes, right? Every year there's new data that comes out. I'd be paying attention to that, and I would start that process as soon as you're underpaid, right? Or as soon as your situation changes, you're taking more call, whatever it is. I don't think you have to wait till the end of the contract.
And what if like you keep talking about the data points.
Yep.
So if someone wants to negotiate or renegotiate, how do they know they're not asking for too much in compensation? Like where do they
Yep.
look?
So that's why I would encourage anybody that's watching this, as a starting point, you can go to resolve.com and get access to these references, right? And you can, use, discounts and things like that from the society that are out there. We think it's really important to monitor. So like in our system, if you log in and you say you're a cardiologist, it's going to ping you every time new data comes out. So you don't have to log in every day, right? It's going to notify you of that. And I think if you know what medians are, if you know what your production is, you can do some fairly easy analysis, right? To say, okay, I'm producing at 75th percentile. this is what 75th percentile makes. Am I there? And if I'm not there, I need to be. Also, if I'm only producing at the 20th percentile, probably doesn't make, a lot of sense for me to go in and ask for the 90th, right? You have to be reasonable in what you're asking for. I mean, that's not a good faith ask. So I think just knowing what the data sets are gives you that range or that bracket of what's going to be reasonable.
Okay. So someone has posted, my employment contract states 15-mile restrictive for 2 years. Would it be unreasonable to ask or unlikely to expect an accommodation to practice within 12 miles as opposed to the 15 miles?
No, I mean, that feels like a pretty reasonable adjustment to me. Now it depends. I think if, there's 3 competitors and they all happen to be at 14 miles, then there's probably a reason they plugged it at 15 to start with. But to me, that seems like a reasonable ask. It doesn't feel like you're cutting it in half or more. So I would certainly not be afraid to make that request.
So it sounds like to me, what you're saying is like everything, you can ask for anything. It doesn't mean you're going to get it. But what's important to you, try to negotiate it. Is that right with what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's right. And the reason for that is if you're doing things in good faith, right? If you're asking for things that are normal, so the 15 to 12, for example, or I produce at the 70th and I want the 70th, they may say no to it, but at least you can feel justified in why you're asking for it. What we don't want to have happen, and employers don't either, right? I mean, they should be wanting this to be the case, is we don't want you to go in and sign a contract or be unhappy in a position and not ask for the things that you want and then burn out and leave, right? I mean, that doesn't do them any good. It doesn't do you any good. And so it's better to have these conversations. If you do it the right way, it shouldn't be offensive. And if they say no to everything, I mean, maybe that does direct your career from there where you want to be. But I think you certainly have to ask.
Yeah. Does contract negotiation differ if you have clinical experience and are not directly out of training?
I think it does. I mean, I think if it's a renegotiation in the same organization, that's different, right? Because you have relationships. I also think if you're moving from one job to the next and you've got experience, you can show what your production was, right? You can show how efficient you were. But the other side of this is when you go to bill, which is still how, right, everything happens. So all the revenue comes in based on what you bill. It doesn't ask how long you've been in practice. So a person that's been in practice for 2 years, when they submit a CPT code, it gets reimbursed the same way as somebody who's been there for 10 years. So I think you have to keep that in mind as well, that experience matters, but it only matters to a certain extent, right? And so I think there's benefits, right, for people post-training, but I think it stops at some point.
Just one more question, unless there's others that come through. For those residents who are looking for their first positions or new physicians who are looking for jobs, and they, in a perfect world, they receive lots of offer letters. Assuming it's not all apples and apples and oranges, does Resolve look at those offer letters? Was that something you do, or do you just look at contracts?
No, we do. So we prefer that people engage us as early in the process as possible, because negotiations usually start during the interview process, right? They're going to ask you some salary questions, and so you should have an idea of, what the market looks like. You definitely want to be careful on letters of intent. Some of those are binding, some of those are not binding. If you sign off on those, you're going to have a really hard time negotiating later on. So we prefer that if you're going to engage us, that you do it prior to getting a letter of intent would be ideal, or at least at that stage.
Okay. If anyone else has, that's something else is coming through. Here we go. So if an employer requires six months notice of termination, what recourse do they have if one must leave in less than that required time?
Yeah, so if this is just a breach of contract question. So if you are supposed to give 180 days or 6 months, and you can only give, let's say, half of it, so you can only give 90 days, technically you're in breach of contract for 3 months, right? So they're going to have to go out and pick up locum coverage or something else, in theory, if they can't rehire somebody at the same rate. And so if they're paying you 200,000 annually and the locum coverage is 250 annually, the damage amount to them, right, for you not being there is that $50,000, right? So they're going to have to try to quantify their damage. We don't see a lot of employers going after physicians, right? If it's close, but if you're leaving them 6 months short and they've got to go out and get coverage, I mean, you may expect, some pushback on that and potential, damage claims that they're going to come to you with.
Thank you, Kyle. It looks like we've answered all of the questions. So with that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everybody. Oh, wait, something new. Oh, thank you for hosting, Kyle. What would be your tips for someone renegotiating their contract, say after 3 or 5 years of employment?
I would try to get your trend, right? I don't know your specialty, but I think, if you can show your production, if you can show a trend the right way, I mean, every contract is forward facing, right? And so employers like to go back and say, well, look at what you did the last 3 years. It's not really about that. It's about what you're going to do the next 3, right? And so if you can show some trend lines and try to make the argument that you're moving the right direction, again, take a look at the data. I'm going to keep saying that, but know where you should be. Know if you're doing other things as well, right? Maybe you should have a medical director title. Maybe there's other leadership components because you've been there so long that you could walk into. But I think all those things matter, and you should have some leverage. If they like you and you want to be there and they don't want to lose you, you really should feel pretty comfortable going into that discussion.
Okay, anything else? Anyone else have a burning question for Kyle?
The other thing I'll say
Him?
is that if there's some are uncomfortable putting questions in, right, with their name on it, my email is on here on this slide. If you've got stuff that you'd rather have, kind of confidential answers on, go ahead and send them over. Happy to do that too.
Perfect. Thank you, Kyle. We
You bet.
appreciate that. That's Kyle@resolve.com. Thank you to you. Thank you to everybody who's listening today. I hope you've got some tips on how to make the most of your employment contract. And by the way, Kyle and his colleagues are offering MSSNY members a 10% discount on their services. So you can go and check that out. Once the link is ready, we'll get it up on the MSSNY website. So on behalf of MSSNY, thank you for sharing your expertise and time with us, Kyle. And thank you to everyone else joining us. And for those of you who are not members of MSSNY, I sincerely hope you will consider it. We're here to help you navigate your career and your business. And to everyone else, thank you for your support. So thank you all for joining us. Make it a great day. Take
Thanks.
care.